So good afternoon, everyone. We're here this afternoon to present the Housing Toolkit, which is kind of an introduction to affordable housing. I'm Monica Abeta. I'm the Executive Director of the North Central New Mexico Economic Development District. And we have Willa Williford and Samantha Snyder here with us to kind of explain how this is going to work and to present the toolkit to us and engage in dialogue this afternoon. So I'll turn it over to Willa.
Thank you so much. So we really appreciate the opportunity to do this Housing 101 or Housing Toolbox training with you. And given that it's a really small group today, I think we'd love to hear a little bit about the specific housing challenges that you're facing. And then we'll work through the toolbox, and please, just raise your hand if you have any questions as we go. And then this recording and these slides will be available for continued use by the North Central New Mexico Economic Development District. So just to start off, and Sonia, are you in a good position to share? Will you just describe a little bit the housing challenges you're facing and your role in the housing partnership?
Sure. Let me just kind of stand here off to the side. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm sorry, I'm talking through a...
Yes,
you're clear. Yeah, okay. Okay, good. So, Taos is facing several housing challenges, I would say, across the spectrum, from emergency shelter needs all the way to workforce housing and home ownership. Where we felt there was some immediate need to address really quickly and prioritize is in the workforce housing sector. Right now, average home price in Taos is about $499,000, which is far out of reach for many locals. And what you're hearing in Taos today is just that many of them are being displaced. Airbnb short-term rentals occupy a lot of the housing space here in the north. So there tends to be this thought that, as a group, Taos Housing Partnership, which is just newly formed with several stakeholders in and around Taos. And I can give you a little bit of background about that. The Laura Foundation and Taos Community Foundation jointly funded a consultant that has helped the county address some of those needs. Project Moxie, this is Jen and her group out of Durango, who have been incredibly supportive to Taos, came in, did an environmental scan, made some recommendations, and have helped really lead the way through several stakeholders. So we've got the county at the table, we have the town at the table, we have private sector as well. We're all just brainstorming ways that we can come together to really address the housing challenges. So that's Taos Housing Partnership. And the thought there is that we would start with some affordable housing projects. And what we mean by affordable housing is just below market homes. Dwellings for home ownership is going to be the primary focus over the next year or so. And with that, the hope is that, we do have some low income apartment complexes that are probably at capacity today. But there's probably folks that are occupying those spaces that could potentially afford a $200,000 home, $150,000 home. But because of the market and the way that it is today, there is nothing for them. So, if we start to develop these homes, home ownership models that are, 200 and below the average home price of $499, probably between 200,000 and 300,000, that we would just see this movement from those folks that could probably move into home ownership and allow some of those low rental income, apartments and whatnot to then be available for those folks that really need them. So that, that has been kind of our focus. We also, several of us, I think there was maybe 11 or 12 of us from Taos that attended the Housing Summit last week. I mean, housing is the number one concern. It's on the minds of every stakeholder in this community. Myself from the Laura Foundation, I hear it in every conversation. We did a survey not too long ago. That is the problem, to attract employment, staffers. We're seeing that with both recruiting and retention for several employers in and around town. That is just a problem for generational families who are seeing their loved ones now moving further and further away. So, it's something that we're actively trying to address. I'd say all hands on deck right now, but the priority right now being that workforce housing and home ownership model. I'd say below the 499,000 mark, and I'd say the sweet spot would be anywhere from $150,000 to $300,000 models.
Wonderful, Sonia. Thank you so much
Sure.
for setting that context. And Nicholas, will you share briefly your the experiences with your organization or community are having in terms of the housing challenge?
Sure. I could share just a little bit about what we've been hearing. My name is Nicholas Maestas, and I'm a field representative for Senator Ben Ray Lujan. And so hearing from constituents on a daily basis about challenges around finding affordable housing, and up to the point where public housing and opportunities for public housing are sparse. The inventory for subsidized housing opportunities throughout the state are challenging. There's more vouchers that are available than units to be able to move into, and so those are some of the challenges that I've been working with constituents on a very local level. So, but happy to learn what tools are in our pocket to be able to utilize and how we can educate our local communities so that they can prepare for the challenges that are being experienced up in Taos and being experienced throughout the state. So hopefully, this is one way that we can learn a little bit more about what North Central is working on and how we can help get that information out to the community. So thanks to North Central for putting this on, and Monica for hosting an event to kind of highlight these issues, knowing that they're a big deal to the community.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for being here. And Rita, would you share, introduce yourself and share the primary housing challenges you're seeing?
Sure. I'll really just reemphasize what Nicholas and Sonia have said. I am a field rep for U.S. Senator Heinrich based in Taos. And I guess on top of what has already been covered, I'll reemphasize the concern about workforce housing, that you really can't enter any other conversation. You can't talk about economic development or any number of other challenges that we're facing without first talking about where will these folks live. And I think beyond that, we're beginning to hear folks really living in a state of frustration that we've been having summits and meetings and conversations now for quite some time. And the problem is only getting more acute. And I think people are beginning to feel a bit more hopeless about solutions. So grateful to you all for putting together this event today, and looking forward to hearing what's in our toolbox. Wonderful.
Thank you. So we'll jump right into that. Samantha and I will share a little bit about our background. I have been working in the below market housing space for about 20 years. I find it to be incredibly dynamic, challenging, and very rewarding work for all the reasons y'all were just describing. And so I have, in this most recent chapter of my career, I have been focusing on rural, mountain, and resort communities and the housing challenges that are unique there. And so I think that the toolbox, in the first phase of my career, I worked a lot with sort of tax credits and vouchers and public housing and the federally available sources. And these don't always match super well with our rural communities, and they can be really challenging. So I think, today we hope to get into some case studies and examples where they have either been used creatively to meet those communities' needs or where other tools have been brought to bear. And then I've had the great pleasure of working extensively over the past year with Samantha as part of our team, and I'll let her introduce herself as well.
Hi, I'm Samantha. I've been working with Willa for about 1.5 years. Started working with her as an intern while I was still in grad school. So I got my master's in regional and urban planning, graduated in May of last year. But have a background in social science research. While I was in school, I worked on a multi-method study on Denver public schools, analyzing over 25 years of school closure data and also looking at kind of school choice policy. And I think all of that is aligning really well with the work that we've been doing in northern New Mexico. And just really enjoying the housing space, kind of like Willow was saying, and doing that consulting work. So I'll go over these really quickly. I think.
Can I interrupt, Samantha,
Yep.
really quick? So I just wanted to give Sean Jeffrey from the Village of Cimarron. Sean, we're just doing introductions. If you want to introduce yourself and maybe talk about anything you want to get out of this webinar today, and we can kind of focus on everyone's interests.
Well, afternoon, everybody. I'm Sean Jeffrey. I'm the administrator for the Village of Cimarron, and I take care of some other communities in Northeast New Mexico. So I guess I wanted to get on here. Felicity kind of threw me out on the stage again, like she has to do every now and then to remind me, because I had forgotten. But to just try to get some information more about the housing, because housing is a big issue, especially up here too. Affordable housing, I should say. So that's kind of why I'm here.
Thank you, Sean. And I'm just going to preface a little bit. So this is intended to be like a really comprehensive it's kind of a little technical, this webinar that we put together today. It covers a lot of different programs and financing sources, and it's meant to be like, that's why we called it the toolbox. It's meant to have everything in it. This isn't going to be applicable to, you know, every single project that you might be thinking of or every single need, but it's kind of a 101 so that everybody has some information and can come back to it later on the website and look up more, because it is a fairly technical field. So thanks, Samantha, for letting me preface it, and I'll let you continue.
Well, and I wonder if Sandra would also like to introduce herself.
Thank you. I appreciate the.
Oh, there we go. Hi, Sandra.
Hello there, Monica.
I couldn't see you.
I'm really more involved in the building side. So what I'm looking for from this toolkit is, you know, kind of the context that all of you can provide. And then I'm involved with a group of people in Southern Colorado, Northern New Mexico, who are trying to figure out whether we can grow and then build with local building materials made out of hemp. And so it's a whole group of people, all of whom have different areas of context. So I'm kind of trying to collect information from this webinar to see whether there's a part that we can play, because if we can do this locally, we accomplish economic development and housing development. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. So I think a lot of the beginning of this presentation is just going to be some of that intro, and then later in the presentation will be a lot more interactive. But I think some of you in your intros did a really good job of talking about why housing is a problem, especially with the limited housing choices. We have a labor shortage problem. Sounds like a huge issue in northern New Mexico. These increasing prices also often causes forced commuting, so people aren't able to live where they work, and so they have to drive far distances, and that contributes to residential sprawl. Also, a big trend is aging populations have a lack of housing to meet their needs as well. And then on the next slide, what is affordable housing? Technically, housing is affordable to a certain income sector if they're paying 30% or less of their income on rent or mortgage and utilities. Oftentimes, affordable housing, when we refer to affordable housing, it's when the public sector has intervened and they put some kind of income restriction on the housing and ensure that those housing units do meet that affordable standard of 30% or less. And oftentimes they put some kind of restriction on the units so that only people of a certain income can be in those housing. But there's also naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA, that happens when there's homes that are just naturally fitting that affordable standard in the market. And then here in this table, you can kind of see what that means in New Mexico. So this is across the whole state. It might be a little different in your specific communities, but if you just take a one-person household at the very medium income, area median income, it's about $48,000 salary a year. If you look at this table, for a three-person household, let's say it's just a single parent with 2 kids and they're making minimum wage 40 hours a week. They're at that 30% AMI at about $18,000 a year. And you can kind of see how that all plays out with the rest of the table. So why is spending less than 30% of your income on housing the standard? So basically, we have that definition to ensure that households are able to pay for other basic necessities. You can see on this diagram on the right, we have all these other, things we have to pay for, like internet, childcare, groceries, think about healthcare as well. But we know that a typical New Mexico family would have a hard time saving for the future or investing in the future, even if they have that affordable housing at 30%. And then this is just another way to show you this housing continuum, the different income sectors. So on the left, we have, the lower incomes. We've got very low income at 60%, moderate income at 80%. And it's up to that 80% mark that a lot of subsidies are provided by the state and by other public sectors. And then on the right, you see there's market rate housing. You have upper middle income and upper incomes. And it's that middle section that I'm hearing some of you often have issues with, and that's often called the missing middle. And that's between 80 and 120% AMI. And this is often the first time home buyers. And it's really hard finding housing for this middle income sector because they're not eligible for these subsidies, but the market is not providing for those incomes.
And I was just going to add, if you're in a community that has low housing costs, and you're in the missing middle or you're in a lower income bracket, that might work out okay. But where we really see a disconnect, and I think to Sonia's point earlier, is like a community like Taos where the incomes are pretty low and the housing is some of the most expensive housing in the state. And so there's a huge gap. So even if, you're a working person and you're making a moderate income, like what would be considered a pretty good income, you still can't afford to buy a house. And so we see that in a lot of communities in northern New Mexico, especially our highest cost communities of, Taos, Los Alamos, and Santa Fe. And those costs, unfortunately, kind of spill over to the rest of the communities in the north, even including, Espanola, Cimarron to some degree. We all feel that spill over a little bit. So just a little bit of context on, where people fall and how housing costs kind of impact your ability to own a home or rent a home.
Thanks, Monica. Yeah, I think that, traditionally we thought of the market as not being very functional for people whose incomes are very low and who are, needing support kind of far on the left side. And in recent years, really sort of since the last recession, that those housing problems have extended further and further up into the market. So with the Taos example, you might even a high income professional household might not be able to find anything. So yeah, so this next section is just a little bit more on the sort of mechanics of why that's happening. So why aren't we constructing enough? Why is there this sort of pretty significant market failure? And so we used a couple examples here to just kind of break that down. So, construction construction costs over the course of my career have been escalating pretty consistently. And then more recently with COVID and inflation, it's gone up dramatically. So, just using this example of like, let's build a little single family home and let's price it for a household at 120% of area median income, a very established middle income household. And we're going to go buy a piece of land for about $15,000. We're going to bring in the infrastructure that's needed, the water, sewer, street, what have you. We're going to build it. We're going to do we're going to design it. We're going to get our permitting fees, and then we're going to go and actually construct it, at about $200 a square foot. And we come up with this total development cost of $280,000, which exceeds what this household can afford. And so this is a negative profit proposition. So the private sector isn't stepping in to say, hey, we'll solve this, because there's it's a money loser. And so that's often where we see community investments needing to happen, whether they're through financing like MFA provides at below market, through communities bringing the land to bear, bringing the infrastructure to bear, or even just providing actual funding that fills this gap. So that is, this is sort of the structural financial piece that we're grappling with on a, I would say, daily basis as housing consultants. And then if we play that out in a larger scenario of trying to build like an apartment building. So this is an example, 45 apartments that are 2 bedrooms. And we do sort of the same exercise, but we look at, okay, what can our rents support? What does it cost us to operate this property? What do we have left over to pay debt? And depending on kind of where we're setting the rents, so like 410 it's a very low rent, but that would be supporting people making that minimum wage, or like a single parent making a minimum wage. If we go up to 60% AMI, which is more like what we're hearing people are currently paying, for example, working with school districts and teachers and so forth, that we can bring about $3.5 million mortgage, but that does not even cover half of the construction costs. So it's a really significant problem in this space. And then, you can kind of do in your own mind, okay, if we double these rents, well, we're going to actually be able to drive enough debt that we're getting close to being able to fund this project. But then you're looking at a rent that people start in the community start to say, that's not affordable for me. And for good reason. So there's, in terms of the capital, and this may be review for some of you all, so thanks for your patience, but in terms of kind of how we crack this nut, there's a couple of different conventional wisdoms. So, if you were building a luxury apartment building in Albuquerque or something, you'd probably expect that you'd be bringing about 30% of owner developer equity, and you'd be financing the rest, and the rents would support that because the rents would be high enough. Then you can use the 4% low-income housing tax credit, and that starts to fill some of the space that this owner equity would provide, and you start to be able to bring down the rents because you're not having to pay that back, or provide a return on investment there. Then this is probably the most salient one for the conversation the group we're having today, is looking at some kind of other replacement local investments. So is it the land? Is it the tap fees? Is it the, I heard some people talking about innovative construction tactics like modular manufactured hemp, straw bale, those kinds of things. Can we do things that start to reduce our costs so we're not actually having to raise as much money? And what I see in most projects is it's a triage thing where you actually attack it with as many different tools as you can. And then, a tool that I am often involved with and I really like, but it has its limitations in rural areas, is the 9% low-income housing tax credit, which really brings the most powerful amount of equity so that you're using a smaller amount of debt and you're able to keep your rents low and really meet the community's needs. Its limitations tend to revolve around you need to have a project of scale, it's very competitive, and sometimes in our rural communities, our incomes are so low that we start to exclude the working people we're trying to serve through the eligibility requirements. So it's not going to solve all our problems, but it is one way that we can address the capital gap that's pretty effective. So that, we're going to transition now into sort of the four compartments of our toolbox, so to speak. I'll go through the first two sets, and Samantha will do the second two. We have some case studies spliced in there, and we would absolutely love to have you share your experiences and ask questions, because this is like the heart of the content that we were hoping to convey today. So we've grouped, because this is a long list of tools, and it's probably, we tried to make it comprehensive, but there may have been things we missed. We've grouped it into these categories just to sort of, give it some structure. So as we look at incentives, the biggest incentive tends to be money. But there's other ways that you can help make projects economically feasible, such as like density bonuses that are included in your code. And again, that kind of has to be balanced with community character and expectations, but especially in places where land costs are high, this can be quite effective. And Jackson, Wyoming is a good example where they were able to do a density bonus that really brought private sector developers into the world of building below market housing because they could experience some upside on market housing at the same time. So fee waivers, this is often, it can be a very small piece of the puzzle if we're talking about like building permit fees, but if we're talking about tap fees and impact fees and water and sewer and those type of things, it can actually add up pretty quickly and make a big difference. And it can also be really helpful as a way to signal to funders that the local community is invested in making the housing happen. We see this, this tool used in a lot of places. It also creates sort of a nexus for developers will come to a community and just say, help me make this financially feasible. And it's a pretty open-ended ask. And this is one, an area in which you've already established a fee schedule, and communities kind of know what incentive they could offer. Accessory dwelling units is a really lovely tool to make and we often refer to it as gentle density. It's like you're adding workforce housing at really at a great price point. If it's a little garage apartment or a lock off within someone's home or casita, and making the most of the water and sewer that already exists in the area, and bringing more housing diversity to neighborhoods that were traditionally maybe single family homes or townhouses. And this is one of those, it's a small thing, but incrementally it can add up, and it can, I think when we survey, we find people really like owners of a primary home and people who would rent an accessory unit really like the living arrangement. And so just, some of the first step with this is just getting out of your own way with your code, making sure it's allowed. And then the next step is getting more sophisticated around truly incentivizing it with pre-approved plans and financial support to people who want to do it. So zoning for affordability, this one's really a catch-all because so much of what we've done with our sort of zoning codes over the past 60 years is counterproductive to affordability. And lots of things with very good intentions have been put in place that really, when you look at them through the lens of death by 1,000 cuts on what makes something able to make this financially feasible or not, our zoning codes have a lot of hurdles. And, you know, some of the hot buttons tend to be parking, and people really, that's very sacred, often in communities. But, you know, if you're requiring that I dedicate as a developer more square footage to parking than to the physical structure of the building, it gets expensive really fast. And, you know, so being able to use the land in a really smart way that's compatible with the community and doesn't throw in unnecessary obstacles. I have in my own community, I have a completely vexing situation where there's lots that are set aside for workforce housing, but they have a requirement that we use a 50% stone facade. And it's like blowing, you know, it blows the construction costs out of the water. And for good reason, nothing's been built there for 15 years. So, and then aligning infrastructure and housing opportunities, you know, so often the role of local governments are related to water, sewer, streets, services, and community infrastructure that if it's thoughtfully coordinated around where there's housing opportunity, then those expenses can be handled by the public sector and start to pave the way to make these projects more financially feasible. So I really like seeing when there's a lot of thinking and planning around expending water and sewer and being conscientious that is then enabling the kind of housing that we want to have happen. So I'll just give one little example. This is from my own community where there was an opportunity for a large scale subdivision in the city of Gunnison, and the city and the developer really worked together to create, this is a zoning for affordability example, to say, hey, the longstanding zoning codes haven't worked well for the type of neighborhood we're trying to create here. Let's really rethink those and be more creative and more responsive to what's going to be affordable. So next we'll just, actually let me pause there. Does anyone want to talk about incentives in terms of something you've seen work well, or any questions you have on the content I covered? All right, we will get head on into regulations. So regulations tend to be very comfortable space for local government. That's what local government's done, for better and worse, for a long time. But one way, you know, to thinking particularly with our affordable and workforce housing lens, there are several specific tools. So inclusionary zoning is a mechanism by which you can sort of counter what, you know, historically zoning has been an exclusionary practice of we don't want that kind of use here, we're segregating things out. In this case, it's saying as we build new housing, we want diversity of income, and we're going to require developers to meet certain percentage thresholds around who can access this housing. So it's a tool that I like. It tends to work best in high-cost communities where developers can write that check and where they're doing luxury kind of product. Where it can be very challenging is if you're kind of on the cusp of making a missing middle type of housing work, and then suddenly you have an additional requirement that's a pretty hefty financial burden on the developer. And I often see pushback in those situations around inclusionary zoning, and for good reason. I don't recommend inclusionary zoning in every community, although I do think the spirit of it is really aligned with our goals, and it can bring creative partnerships to bear. If, you know, for example, if you have a lot of development activity in your community that's private sector, you know, luxury focused, what have you, that they will then be incentivized and compelled to work with nonprofits and housing authorities to meet their inclusionary zoning requirement and start to get some of those projects off the ground. And so I see some very tangible benefits. Again, it's just not for every community. Residential linkage. So this, and again, tends to be kind of a tool for more resort-oriented communities, but appreciating that very large homes and homes that are not occupied year-round or occupied as short-term rentals generate a demand on our workforce that's pretty significant, and that can be quantified, and then communities can enact enact a linkage fee associated with, this new residential development is generating X number of jobs, therefore we're going to set aside the housing needed to support those employees. So that is, then you do need to go the next step of having a nonprofit or housing authority or local government implement spending that money. It's not enough to just collect it. It then has to be used for the purpose of housing the workforce. And I see some communities get they implement the fee, but then they get a little stuck at the next step of like turning that money into housing. Commercial linkage, runs on the same principle. And I think of this often in places where they're building a lot of like luxury hotels or high-end commercial, and that's generating the need for a lot of employees. And so then that fee can be assessed against the commercial development and used to build workforce housing. And then finally, annexation policies, which I think are actually more sort of versatile and perhaps applicable broadly in northern New Mexico. And that, is just the expectation that when a new parcel of land is going to be part of a town or a city or a village, and it's going to have access to municipal services, that there's some kind of community benefit conferred. And that I love to see community benefits ordinances drafted that say, we'll consider annexing your property, but it has to be 30% workforce housing or 50% workforce housing, and then defining that, as it works for your community, what that looks like, what the needs are. So that can signal to developers, what the community values and their intent, and then also, set up the framework for negotiation as parcels come in. All of these development regulations do hinge upon the environment being ripe for development. So for places where there hasn't been much building activity or the market isn't sort of established and strong, it's better to look more in the incentives bucket. And then in general, I like to say, don't focus a strategy in one single area. Like look at making sure you have a whole suite of different tools you can use.
So Willa, that was the question I was going to ask, is that, if you don't have a lot of development activity going on in your community, there's really nothing to kind of multiply, what I mean? There's nothing to base that, inclusionary zoning on or whatever. And then I just want to point out that for, I actually don't know how many communities in the nation have inclusionary housing. I know Santa Fe is one of the few that has a pretty robust program, but I would think that you'd want a certain, not only some development, but like all of this stuff, there's a regulatory component to it, right? That you have to staff up, you have to have, internal staffing and capacity to handle this stuff. So, you kind of need, in a really small community, it might be difficult to manage the responsibilities of those types of programs.
Definitely. Yeah, that's a really good point, Monica. And, the one place I would say that, right, so inclusionary zoning is a good fit if you already have a lot of development activity or you think about a lot is about to start. And so, a place where I felt like it was really, Salida, Colorado is a place that implemented inclusionary zoning about 5 years ago. And they got a lot of pushback around, this is going to kill the missing middle. This is going to, all the development projects are kind of come to a screeching halt. The economy was such that that didn't happen at all. And it actually was, I think, a pretty good successful example where they were, they were able to get a significant increase in the workforce housing production through that tool. Another place that's just in the process of implementing it is a really small town, Hayden, Colorado. And it's downstream from Steamboat Springs, and they have a lot of large greenfield kind of lots. And they're thinking that they want to have it in place ahead of those developments coming in, even though they're at the point where they've only been pulling like 5 to 7 permits per year. So it's like, you're not what I would classically think of as a community that's a good fit for this, but I think they do have some foresight. But and there's plenty of other places where I've worked where they're like, I wish we'd done inclusionary zoning several years ago. So I agree though that partnerships and incentives are a better space to be in for very small communities and for communities where development hasn't happened lately. So I'll give this example because it's an annexation policy example from the Gunnison Valley. And this neighborhood is all deed restricted to local workforce. It ranges from 80% AMI to about 200% AMI. These little houses, in the forefront are adjacent to a giant, beautiful park. And across the park are houses that look very similar that are $4 million a piece. So both sides of the park were part of the annexation. They ended up, through extensive negotiations, the town got the lots over here. In the very far distance, you see the public works, and that's why the developer wanted the workforce housing over here. It's like a buffer to the public works space, but you don't even notice that at all now that the neighborhood is built out. And so these are mostly little triplexes. And then there's duplexes back here, and it's been built over time, and is really like the most fun neighborhood because all the lights are on, as opposed to other parts of town. So I will hand it to Samantha now, unless there are any questions or conversation on development regulations. Yeah, let's keep on going.
All right, so now we're going to talk about public-private partnerships. Oftentimes, the public is providing funds or land, and there could be a private entity that's developing or managing housing. And also, we have this blank select examples column, so if anyone has any examples, please just chime in or even put them in the chat, and we're going to try to fill those in as we go. So the first one is public land, private developer. So, a municipality could have their own publicly owned site, and they can put up an RFP to get a developer, a competitive process to get a developer to develop on that land. And then there could be ownership of the land retained through long-term land leases. This can be for ownership or rental, and low to middle income tiers. Next is employee assisted housing. I'm hearing this is a big issue is workforce housing. And so we've seen it with school districts where they provide housing, or maybe they even just provide mortgage assistance or something like that to attract and retrain employees. And that can be both rental or ownership, but rental is much more common, and that's usually the low to middle income tier. And then short-term rental management, as we heard in Taos, this is a big issue with short-term rentals like Airbnb taking up a big portion of the housing inventory. So this could be in the form of regulation or incentives for people who own these short-term rentals to incentivize them to make those long-term rentals instead. So you could be providing rent guarantees and property management in exchange for renting those units long-term. A lot of times a municipality might track licensing, they might limit how many short-term rentals are in an area. And that's especially important in these areas that are kind of more resort towns or places with a lot of tourism. And that's usually like a moderate income tier. And does anyone have any examples they want to shout out for public-private partnerships? Or you can put them in the chat.
I was just going to say that I think the affordable, those of you who went to the housing conference last week, so I think the Affordable Housing Act in New Mexico is kind of structured around the first example, which is, you know, in order for, because we have the anti-donation clause as part of New Mexico's constitution, in order for a local government to donate land for affordable housing, they basically have to develop a affordable housing plan. And then that affordable housing plan kind of identifies the income levels where there's a need. And then they would basically put out like an RFP to find a developer to work with through a public procurement process. So that's typically what's required if a local government or a school district or another public entity, like maybe a hospital, would want to donate land for housing. So I just wanted to throw that out there. And I don't know, did any of you attend an Affordable Housing Act presentation last week at the summit? Nicholas, did you?
This is Nick. I'll just kind of add on to that because I think it was a theme that was talked about throughout, just how local governments can prepare and be ready for opportunities as they come up. And if they're thinking, you know, into the future about, you know, developing housing, how they can do that. And so one of the things that was talked about, just to kind of add to that, what could be done on a local level or a government level, is to have their zoning department or zoning structures done in a way where before they approve or deny a project, they're having to review the housing for the region, the housing stability or the housing needs of the region before, like I said, either approving or denying a project. And so, so determining, you know, that could benefit some of those areas that are in need of housing. Or are, you know, have a short inventory or small inventory of housing in the area. So just a couple of, you know, some of the feedback that can be done on a local level to bring attention to and kind of prevent, you know, the mixing of different projects that could actually bring some good housing opportunities to the community.
Yeah, and I think we could amend this slide to just get a little bit of that specific Housing Act verbiage in here. I mean, it's certainly, you know, I see it as a best practice to study your market, and then, you know, if you're putting a public resource on the table, have a fair and open process around how you select a partner. But you know, it sounds like that's actually, you know, if that's codified in New Mexico, we'll just spell it out as such. Other examples, anyone familiar with any employers or, oh, nice, we got university. Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Sandra. And then I know, you know, I'll just, you know, add to Samantha's commentary around short-term rental management can be a very fraught topic. I think that it's a mixed thing because the short-term rentals can bring tourism and really variety and support sort of some things on the economic development side. But there is definitely a very clear relationship with increasing short-term rentals, eroding the workforce housing inventory. It's very often this very same home being used in a different way. And so, you know, I've been surprised at how quickly and how far-reaching it is in terms of impacting communities, you know, beyond traditional tourist destinations. So even, you know, communities where maybe seasonal hunting is a big deal, or just that people can make a little more money that way than a long-term rental. So it's, I don't think it's a problem that's going away.
Yeah, well, and I think, you know, one of the things we even brought up at the summit here for Taos is not just short-term rentals in and itself of like individual homeowners that have bought these properties and have turned them into those type of properties, investments. It's the commercial, it's the, you know, Zillow's buying up 10 homes. It's the, you know, it's those type of entities, the commercial side, that's buying up several homes. And the other piece is the location of these homes typically are close proximity to access, which is really important to maintain affordability. And so, you know, I don't know how we manage those pieces, but I would say like locally for Taos, that's something that's like top of mind is this commercial side of STRs.
Yeah.
And, you know, we talked a lot about incentives in this toolbox, and it's always hard to have the conversation around how do we de-incentivize some of these things, right? But I think both of them are required to kind of balance these things out. The hard part is we didn't have a lot of these things in place, so we're here now, right? With most of our market saturated by STRs. It's hard to undo what's already been done without some of these incentives, or building out even further. But what that means is that we're building out and needing some costly infrastructure, which is further, out into, not close to proximity to the hospital and schools and whatnot. So access is still a barrier to maintain affordability. So, I mean, I just don't see how we move on the conversation of building affordable housing without addressing the short-term, without managing short-term rentals.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you loud and clear, because you could invest all your time and resources into floating the boat over here, and if it's draining out over there, you're treading water. So, or I'm mixing up my analogies, but yeah, you're if you're losing ground in the short-term rental space, as you're working so hard to gain traction with your new workforce development, it's a pretty frustrating situation.
Yeah, and I think Taos is so like not moderate, right? In a lot of these ways, like some short-term rentals in moderation might be an okay thing for some communities, like you brought up, Willa, if you have like private tours and a hunting season, and or like, I mean, I actually have one, I have a vacation rental here in Albuquerque, and it's by the hospital, and it's almost entirely rented by visiting nurses. So it's meeting a workforce need. But in Taos, like, just want to say everything in Taos seems to, like, real estate wise, just seems to, not be moderate at all. Like it just goes, it's in a state now where you're right, Sonia, like it's just out of control. Yeah. And so it has to be managed in order to get some kind of viable solution in place.
Sure. And at the same time, there's the conversation of, how do you use these additional units to help offset some of these mortgages? Because that does maintain affordability for those that are primary residents and living here full time. So, it's a big conversation that needs to be had. It's slow process for us to get to a place of here's the policy, here's the things that we would need to generate to then enforce. And we're there already. We're already saturated in that sense.
Yeah.
No, I don't, this is probably naive because I've never been involved in the short-term rental market, but part of what I believe is attractive is if you have a short-term rental is that you put it on a site and all you have to do is you have to keep it clean, you have to be responsive and so on and so forth. So you pay for that, but it's not a huge amount. I wonder if there's a way for the town or the county to develop some sort of a program that would provide equal or better services for long-term rentals, for workforce rentals, so that it becomes easier to rent easier and net more profitable to rent long-term than it is to rent short-term, even for some portion of the buildings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely one of the tools you can bring to bear.
That's what you're referring to, right, Willa, here with your short-term rental management, is kind of providing an incentive for people to keep it in the long-term rental space, right?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot, you can titrate this in a lot of different ways. I mean, you can just straight up cap it and regulate it, and have fines and so forth, or you can try to bring people, from one bucket into the other. And I'll give the example of Winter Park, which, they were employee shortages excruciating, and they were heading into the winter season, and they're like, we're not going to have a functional ski season or user experience if we don't do something for workforce housing. So we're going to set aside $350,000 and we're going to match short-term rental people with employees. And the housing coordinator there said, I'm lighting my housing dollars on fire, but it's worth it because we're going to keep our economy alive this winter. And it did work. But the struggle there was that once they spent that incentive, those units could then go back into the short-term rental inventory. So their long-term strategy was we want to do permanent workforce housing, but we know we have this as like a stopgap measure, and we can. The nice thing is it doesn't have nearly the long lead time or that and risk that doing new development or construction would have, or even converting like a existing building into workforce apartments. So yes, I know, I agree. I think you're totally on the right track there, Sandra. Around
and not to
it's an
belabor
economic proposition, right? Like which use is an owner going to do?
And, I know you all want to move on. I just wanted to say it's a temporary thing, like you said, Willa. So you're putting money into, some temporary thing that just has the ability to go right back to short-term rental. And it's almost like a voucher in a way. Voucher programs are really expensive because you're basically subsidizing these, you're basically providing something every month to get people by, right? Or in this case, every month to have a long-term renter or a workforce person in there instead of a short-term renter. And they are really expensive, and it doesn't ever amount to anything permanent. It's a temporary solution. So it's definitely an option. It's just maybe not the best option.
Yeah, I think it's
One of many.
kind of to be considered in the environment of what are the trade-offs you're considering, you're faced with. Sorry, I think someone else was trying to chime in. No? Okay. Samantha, do you want to talk a little bit about the Thoreau example?
Yeah, so this is an example of employer-assisted housing, and we see that a lot in other school districts, but this is a really successful example in Thoreau where they currently have 44 units in this very rural community. And teacherages are when the schools provide housing for teachers and other staff. And it's a neighborhood of a small community of affordable housing. And this is under the Gallup-McKinley School District. And they use state money, school revenue bonds to fund this. And the school district as a whole has over 262 occupied teacherage units, with more being built. And it's been so successful that teacher vacancies in Thoreau were cut by 95% and improved academic performance quite a lot. And this is just like a really good way for school districts to be able to retain employees. There's another one we might get to later where I talked to them and they said we would not be able to attract any teachers if we weren't providing housing.
I love how quantified the positive outcomes are on this one. It's pretty inspiring and kind of demonstrating of the, sometimes the do nothing is a really damaging option.
Yeah, and these rents are amazing. A 1-bedroom is $350 a month, $450 for 2 bedrooms, $550 for 3 bedrooms.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
this model it's so inspirational on one end, and it makes me even think about a stable economy for any rural community, for any community. We think about our education system, our healthcare system, public safety, all of those things. And if we develop these type of models in each of those areas, that could help stabilize economy. If that's the priority and focus with teaching staff, healthcare, public safety, fire and police officers and whatnot. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Now for public and nonprofit initiatives. So sometimes that's a partnership and sometimes it's not. But the first one is housing, rehab, and weatherization. So this could mean repairing, updating, improving energy efficiency. It could be providing access for people with disabilities. And this is typically with federal or state dollars, but it could be administered through a nonprofit or the local agency itself. And this could be for both ownership or rental and lower incomes. And what's really important about improving energy efficiency specifically is that that can really make a difference in someone's housing costs per month, because it can decrease their utilities and make it actually affordable for them. And then acquisition.
Comment there.
Yeah.
Just like a bad example of why this is so necessary, because we did have one complex that was all electric, but because it wasn't built well, these folks, which they're in low income affordable housing apartment units, were seeing like $700 a month electric bills.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And that again, I mean, if you're paying $300 for rent, but your electric bill is $700, it makes 0 sense. So weatherization, agreed, this is something that we need to be doing hand in hand with new builds.
And there's, one of the things in that space is that we do have these federal and state programs, but they're typically not enough, and so, anytime there's the opportunity to add capacity in those spaces, that can really help bring our.
For new builds, I think this makes a lot of sense. Where we struggle with weatherization in small rural communities is these homes are really old.
Oh.
So when they get in there, they identify, well, this isn't fixed, or this would need to be done, and this isn't really going to help offset it if we don't fix all of these things. It's almost, more efficient to build a new home. And so that's one thing that we're hearing and seeing just in small rural communities with older builds and weatherization or rehab projects.
Yeah, Sonia is exactly right about that. I was going to say from my experience, working at MFA prior to coming to North Central. So they have a New Mexico Energy Smart Weatherization program. And at that time, I don't know what the limit is now. At that time, it was like, I think $7,500 per home was the limit. And what you ended up really doing was not, a lot of times, not even really it was weatherization, but there were a lot of health and safety issues that could be addressed under that program. And so a lot of folks had leaky furnaces, things that were just dangerous. So a lot of times the money for weatherization was going into things like that. And then there'd be a certain amount of insulation and things done, but it'd be funny because people would ask us are you going to replace our windows? And it was we will never get to replace your windows. There are so many other things before that have to be done that are lower cost and more critical. So it just really is, it isn't enough money in the amount, and it isn't enough money to address all the needs in older homes for sure. So it's challenging, but it's a great need in New Mexico.
Yeah, and I think that this may be a space that's more almost advocacy oriented too, because the regulations have not kept up with the construction costs and the challenges that are, if you're taking the time to go in and audit a building and try to bring everything up to speed, let's bring everything up to speed and not have sort of an arbitrary cap on what can be done. But anyhow.
I'm glad Monica brought up the weatherization program, because I just talked with HUD today. They're talking about the Healthy Homes Weatherization Cooperation grant that they have, as well as some of their opportunities for older adult home modification funds. So working through HUD, but I don't know who the fiscal agent would be, right? If it's MFA, if it's a nonprofit, if it's the homeowner, if it's the entity, the local government entity. So each grant has different opportunities or for who can apply, but or eligibility rather. And so I'm glad those are some things that are on the radar as far as how to improve the quality of life for some of these communities and bring their energy costs down so it could be more affordable.
So Nick, I don't want to take up time on this webinar. Maybe we could talk later, but the older adults home modification program, I think, is a new program that was rolled out a couple of years ago. And we actually unsuccessfully applied for it that first year because we run the area agency on aging for the whole state. So we thought that would be the whole state except for Bernalillo County. So we thought we would be a good conduit for those funds. And we had a debrief with them, but the issue was that we really need like a rehab partner, like the actual people that are going to go in and do the work. And so that was challenging because a lot of areas of the state, we don't have capacity for that. So I'd love to talk to you about that more. I think that's something we really, that's a source that would really beef up the weatherization, the rehab offerings in our state for that
Agree.
particular population.
Okay, sounds good.
Excellent.
And not to continue to belabor this, but also USDA Rural has some incentive programs for low income and aging populations to also do the same type of thing. So, maybe bringing those programs together and figuring out, hey, which one needs to be the caveat or the angle that we use to address these issues. So I'm just kind of figuring out who those partners are that we can help bring to the table.
Great. Let's definitely talk about that. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, I think that where I see these programs working the best is when there are all the partners coming together to say, we're going to triage this house. And you have this funding source, I have this funding source, and we're going to like make it all work, which seems it's a little over, it can feel a little overly complex, but I think I love that there's this conversation coming out of this call to try to add some juice to that. So let's keep working our way through the nonprofit and public initiatives, and I'll hand it back to Samantha.
Yeah, so the next tool is acquisition of existing housing. So a nonprofit or a public agency could buy down the price of units with public funds and impose deed restrictions for permanent affordability. So that would work in the case that there are homes that are affordable enough to buy out and put those deed restrictions on them to maintain affordability. And that could be rental or for sale. Rental's more common, and low to middle income tier.
And I've seen this tool kind of regain popularity now that construction costs are so high.
Public sector development. So instead of the public sector buying out houses, they're developing homes themselves. This is really common with housing authorities that are actually initiating, designing, financing, and constructing those homes, usually on publicly owned land. Often moderate incomes and in both rental and for sale. Homebuyer assistance. This is a really common way to address housing needs, both in the nonprofit and public sectors, with usually public funds, to use down payment assistance or mortgage assistance for purchasing deed restricted or market rate units. So sometimes they have a program where they're actually just giving money to someone buying a market rate home, and to bridge that gap between what they can afford and what those prices are in the market. And that's obviously home ownership and low to middle incomes. And then lastly, small scale development for low income buyers. This is really common with Habitat for Humanity, and they use volunteer labor for low income buyers. And so both with using volunteer labor or sweat equity of those self-help builds to offset those costs and make it more affordable by not having as much of the labor costs that a normal development would have. I don't know if there's any other organizations in New Mexico that you guys know of that are doing similar things, but if you want to say any other examples, we'd love to add those in.
The one that comes to me is HomeWise, right? Because they do some USDA type builds, I think. You all, yeah.
They have, they do down payment. Well, they do development. They develop homes. They do most of the things here. They do acquisition, rehab, for sale as well. And I think they probably out of most entities have a really intensive home buyer training process. Like they really stay with people for a long time, getting them ready to purchase their first home. It's not like a 2-hour online class. It's a little more involved. So that's a good thing.
That's great. And here's a case study for housing rehab. This is in Custer, Colorado, and it's a really good example of converting a district-owned vacant building. It was a preschool building into 4 one-bedroom units, and they used community volunteer labor as well as high school students who are in trade classes for rehabbing. And this is a really awesome way to offset those costs, especially because labor costs are becoming so expensive, and it's also a way to get, you know, students involved in these projects as well.
Did my screen share just freak out on you?
Yes, but I think we're good now.
Okay. Oh, let me go back. Sorry about that. I tried to open the Prosperity Network link and it disrupted the share. So let's talk a little bit about funding. I know this was very important to many people as a topic as they registered, and it's clear it's, you know, one of the big gaps. So, you know, and there's good news and bad news in this space. So the low-income housing tax credit is currently like the gold standard tool that's being used to develop the most below market rate housing across the nation. You know, I highlighted earlier in the capital stack sort of some of the limitations of this tool, and, you know, particularly the size of the project and the eligibility requirements around income. MFA obviously has a plethora of different funding mechanisms that they use, and it sounds like they're trying to, you know, make that more robust and more responsive to the needs that are out there. We do have a summary sheet of their different funding options, if that's helpful, that we could circulate with the slides, and how those can support different types of goals you might have. CDBG and home are federal funding sources. I have been seeing a lot of CDBG funds used, particularly in the infrastructure space. They obviously come with the restrictions and challenges of using federal money, but it can go a long way, and it can overcome some of those financial hurdles if you use these funds to fill the gap. And they can be often structured as paths through grants. Then local taxes, fees, and general fund money. You know, I think that it's so often the local community, or be it an employer or a major institution or, you know, local government, really putting skin in the game to make this happen is sort of what moves us from that, oh, we're having another seminar about housing, to we're actually having something built. And I think that's, you know, so often this is where it's such a challenge in small communities where people are spread so thin and budgets are very, very small. But that is, you know, if there's a single, you know, I'm very much an advocate for kind of using all the tools or like using a lot of tools and sort of pushing them forward in a strategic way. But if you have to just pick one, it might be, you know, a single time general fund allocation to make this specific housing happen, you know, and then finally, you know, we have philanthropy, which I've seen as a very mixed bag in the housing space. Not something that is sort of consistent and you can count on the way large nonprofit, you know, certain nonprofits are real sort of fundraising machines. But I've seen really impactful, amazing things from faith communities, from, you know, foundations who take an interest in housing, and from local people who may have means, who are just passionate about the issue. So it's very much, I feel like, a nuanced thing with philanthropy around local, you know, around local relationships and the exact project you're doing, sort of attracting the right kinds of people who take an interest in care and want to make it successful. So, and this probably is how I've survived 20 years of doing below market rate housing, because I'm very firm believer in design, like create a vision for the housing you need and want in your community and make it really tangible, and then go and attract the dollars to it that you need. And Monica and I have been working on some of that with our site-specific work in this contract around, wow, that's a really, it's a staggering gap. We need $3 million more dollars, or what have you, and then let's chip away at that. Is there congressionally directed spending we could apply for? Are there CDBG funds? How can we layer those things up so that we ensure that this could actually move forward? So I'd love to hear other people's examples of creative funding or things that have been successful. It's a great place to learn from one another. I just recently learned in Colorado about something called like the Rural Water Resource something authority, and it can actually provide water and sewer services to mobile home parks and affordable housing communities. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's a new source, and a couple communities have now tapped into it. So yeah, I'd love to hear what are you all seeing as successful in this space?
Just to add to the conversation, not that I had any part to do with some of the project, but at the Housing Summit last week, I want to say Priscilla from the Southwest COG had mentioned that they utilized some brownfield funds to reclaim an old hospital that they were able to, I'm not going to think of the right word, to mitigate the asbestos and the lead, or, you get that all taken care of. And then not repurposed, but they were able to demolish and then come back with a housing developer to develop out a senior living facility to address the need in their community. And so utilizing those outside resources with, some of those buildings that have been there forever that are still just around that they haven't been able to do anything with. I'm just leveraging some of those other federal resources to try and repurpose those, either repurpose those facilities or just make sure that they're safe to demolish and move on to another opportunity to meet the needs of the community. So so just one example. I mean, there's a whole lot of other just resources to be able to help address some of these needs, but figuring out what needs to be done so that they can move forward with that project. So I don't know if you're familiar with it, but just another opportunity.
Excellent, thank you.
That's a good one. I don't know if Sean had anything. I was going to add a couple things. I think that this, and it came up earlier when you were doing the employer or the school district. I'm sorry, I think it was a school that was developed into 4 units. I don't think it was the employer assisted. It was the Custer example, I believe. But I think in some of these cases, and Willa brought this up earlier, we've been working with the Cimarron School District the past few months. And I think the last meeting we had this week, I mean, the feeling is it's just pretty heavy right now to figure out how to fund new development. It's really expensive. And so we start looking at what are some of the resources the community already has in place. And in this case, we were talking about acquisition rehab of existing homes, but the school district also brought up the fact that, looking at buildings that can be rehabbed into housing that could have been, public buildings or old hotels, for example. I was just thinking about, when I've done site visits in Raton, they have, I think, at least one school, because the population has decreased in Raton, that's no longer in use, that could be repurposed, and they have an old hotel as well. And so some of these resources that are already out there might be, the best way to go. I mean, it also has the dual effect of, community revitalization, something that you're currently not using that's vacant. It's not always cheap to do rehab, but in today's environment, I think we're seeing that rehab is probably cheaper in most cases than new construction. So I think that's a good example. And yeah, Priscilla in Southwest is really the guru of using brownfields funds for creative projects. So she did a really nice job with that hospital project. I was also just going to add real quick, since no one else is chiming in. So CDBG in our state is kind of unique. CDBG and home, which you know, Sam and Willa just had up on the last slide. So in a lot of states, the same agency will basically oversee both the CDBG and the home program. And a lot of times that is the housing finance agency for the state, like MFA. But in our state, it's bifurcated. So DFA, you know, Department of Finance and Administration, oversees the CDBG program, and MFA oversees the home program. And what that has meant historically is that CDBG is pretty much focused on water and wastewater needs, sometimes on transportation projects, but it has rarely been used for housing. And while it is a statutory purpose, and I think you could make that argument, it really just, you know, depends on the priorities of the state. So it's kind of one less, I guess, tool that we have in New Mexico for housing is CDBG. Although we've been talking about, like in the case of Cimarron, if we were going to do some new development, could we use CDBG to do the water and wastewater extensions? Maybe not for the housing itself, but actually to extend the utilities to the site. And that might be a more appropriate use of CDBG, the way, you know, DFA likes to see those applications. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. That's, you know, and that does circle back to that, the planning and incentives tool we talked about around aligning infrastructure investments with housing opportunities, that, you know, making sure those two arms are speaking to one another, because especially in your case where you don't have sort of a direct housing line to CDBG, that advocacy is really important. So
I have a quick question on some of the conversation. So talking about incentivizing, so with businesses coming in and economic development, you know, brings in more jobs. And you talked a little bit earlier about requiring the business that comes in to, you know, have a portion of, you know, help out basically with providing some housing for their workforce. At whatever avenue. I'm sure there's a lot of negotiating and conversations around that. Just, you know, through this economic development conference this week, we were talking about some of the tax incentives and some of the incentives to recruiting businesses to New Mexico. And so I guess one of the questions that just, you know, through this conversation is, you know, at what point would you begin to negotiate with businesses if you're bringing in, you know, 1,000 employees, you know, is it a portion? Is it should it be through the low income housing, or what is it, I guess through our ordinance that we're developing out land? Should the city come to the entity with land proposition, or I guess how would that conversation flow? Would it be up to the business, you know, that's wanting to do business in New Mexico to come up with, you know, the whole scope, or I guess what are your thoughts on how that would develop out, given some of the examples that you've shared?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I think there's no probably single simple answer, but it's an interesting thing to get our heads around, right? Of like, we're trying to recruit businesses and we want these jobs and very much, and they're going to really support vibrancy and self-sufficiency in the community. And yet they could actually intensely exacerbate our housing problems, right? And so on the one hand, you're offering a tax incentive, and on the other hand, you're probably not, you know, wanting to say at the same, in this, you know, out of the other side of your mouth, and you have to help us solve our housing problem, right? So, so I think getting really clear up front about that is important. And, you know, I was thinking of, you know, there some of those big national competitions around, you know, like, I think Amazon and other companies were you know, offering or relocating headquarters and sort of creating these competitive situations. And there were certain communities where they're like, you know, that would bring things to our community, but it would also hurt our community around competition for the housing resources. So, I mean, I think where I'll go with this comment, and I'd love to hear from others on the phone because I think you introduced a really complex and important question, is that, you know, economic development and housing are inextricably linked at this point in all the communities where I work. And so to do one without the other is not going to be successful, but they might not happen. You know, there may be one suite of strategies you're using around attracting new businesses and another suite of strategies you're using around increasing your housing supply, and they might just have there might be certain sort of dotted lines or overlaps between them, but you might not be able to sort of get both of those to happen through a single mechanism.
Okay.
Monica, do you have some thoughts to add on that?
I was just going to say, I mean, this is unfortunately not a problem we run into in northern New Mexico a whole lot, where we have like a big employer moving in and we can extract some, you know, something out of them, or we're concerned about them, you know, really tilting the housing market. I mean, I think what we have more, as Sonia was kind of articulating, are, you know, retirees that come in or investors that come in and buy up homes as an investment. But I think, you know, that can usually be done through the zoning code, you know, where you, if it is an employer, like Willa was talking about Amazon, and you have, you know, a certain size of development coming in, then you can attach those types of requirements to it. And usually that's, like you're saying, well, I think it is good to kind of have them, I don't know, like, not like you're negotiating a deal. I mean, you do get into that deal negotiation, but there's kind of an expectation that if you're going to have this impact on a community, you're going to be paying for some of that. And then usually it's going to go to a public hearing where there's going to be elected officials making a decision. And then sometimes those requirements get more nuanced, you know, like there's additional requirements or there's less requirements or whatever, based on what the developers is proposing to do. So I think it's a lot of that is usually done through the zoning ordinance, but we haven't seen a lot of that in our region recently that I can think of.
Good. Thank you for both of those thoughts. I think it's just a conversation I think is going to continue as we try to increase our economic development and diversification in New Mexico. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. All right, so we talked about, so this is a nice little case study just around layering the HUD program, which can provide supportive housing and for vulnerable populations, kind of an ongoing rent subsidy, with the low-income housing tax credit, which is more of an IRS program that allows you to build the buildings. So, you know, just kind of around, you know, highlighting a creative way, and I like the little houses that seem like, you know, high quality and kind of responsive to the style of a lot of the communities in northern Mexico.
And I think Willa, I kind of recommended that one because were we back on, was it Vista Gallina? That was funded. Low-income housing tax credit projects tend to be apartments, you know, high-rise apartments, or in the case of New Mexico, maybe they're 3 or 4 story apartments or even 2-story apartments, but they can be done in this kind of lower rise, more dispersed, you know, townhome, condo, or that doesn't even look like a townhome or condo. It can be done in a way that's more appropriate in rural settings. In New Mexico, we do have numerous developers that have done really small tax credit projects. This was a tax credit project, right, Willa?
Yeah. And I know at 14 units, I was like, that's probably the smallest one I've ever seen.
Yeah. It's not the best way to use the 9% low-income housing tax credit program. I mean, it's not really, the efficiencies just aren't there to operate. But we do have a fair amount of small projects in New Mexico that are like 25 to 50 units, just because of the, you know, the rural populations and the need to spread these dollars across the state. The thing about, you know, that Willa mentioned before, the low-income housing tax credit is really targeted to people that make 60% area median income or less. And so it really doesn't allow you to address, you know, the professional workforce really at all. So for most of the, the needs that were brought up for this conversation, it's really a difficult tool to use for the workforce needs that we've been discussing.
Excellent. So that brings us to, so we have kind of a pause worked into our slide deck here. We have a couple more case studies that we'd be happy to share if that approach is helpful. But we thought it would be just good to kind of hear from you all around, have we addressed what you'd hope to learn about, or there are things you want to circle back on? Are there things you want to share around what's been working well? I think it's been such a nice small group. We've kind of done that pretty successfully along the way. This is just a open floor for a moment, and then we can, Samantha and I can wrap up with the remaining case studies. And we also appreciate if, people need to leave, that's fine as well.
I don't really have questions. I think that we've kind of been able to talk through, some of these areas, some of the questions that you have. But I guess one suggestion, and I know that MFA worked really hard to develop out their housing strategy. And so just trying to understand, how that could be part of the conversations moving forward. And I guess more specifically, how local communities can utilize the data that it was included in that strategy as they prepare and move forward with, grants and requests and funding opportunities, different things that come up. But, and I think that would be valuable to the local communities as well. So just understanding. So yes, I guess, incorporating some of that that's already been, some of the homework that's already been done, and incorporating that into, future requests, future applications and whatnot. So, so we can hopefully move the needle forward a little bit in addressing the needs of the state.
So Nick, I think they just released that last week, right? I actually haven't had a chance to review it, but I think that's a really, really good point. And especially as we at North Central are writing a lot of grants right now, as we're doing a lot of grant writing for our region. So using that as a tool will be really important. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I was hoping MFA would be here today, but we will be sharing this work is funded by MFA, putting together this toolbox. And so we're recording it and we'll be sharing it with them as well. So we'll follow up with some of that. As you all may know, MFA was successful in getting a kind of a permanent earmark for affordable housing in the last legislative session. That money will be available in 2024. And I'm pretty sure that their housing strategy is, the first step in trying to outline, maybe some of the new investments they'll try and make with those dollars. I would assume that there's probably a lot of data around rehab needs. I would assume some of the needs we talked about today, workforce housing, rehab, some of the things that MFA currently may have programs, but it's not enough, or may not have programs in the case of workforce, are in that strategy, and hopefully they can develop some tools around those. Sandra or Sean, do you all have any? You guys have been a great panel, by the way. I feel like we should have been a panel at a conference. Sean or Sandra, do you all have anything you want to add here at the end?
Well, I think I feel as though I've been a great listener. That's kind of what I really enjoyed all the information that's been presented. And because I come at this from a very specific angle, which is really what can we do for rehab? I'm excited by the fact that all of you are seeing that as something that needs to be addressed, because if we're going to be sustainable and we're going to be producing homes that people actually want to live in, we also need to get rid of the homes that are uncomfortable and miserable by improving them, not by tearing them down. So, you know, I don't think there is any single answer there in terms of how to do that. And I certainly don't have anything more than a little slice of an answer, but I think together we can pull it together. And I'm really impressed with the work that all of you have done in putting together this information in the toolbox. I think there's going to be a lot of call for it moving forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much for the feedback and your participation and perspective. That was really helpful.
Willa, one thing I think I'd like to add, if we could add this to the printed toolbox or the one we post, you know, just as a PowerPoint. I know that Taos is really interested in a real estate transfer tax, and I don't know if we discussed that. I wonder if we could add that.
You can certainly add that, yes. So the principle here is that every time a home is sold, a portion, a 1 or 2 or 5 or whatever the number is percent transfer tax is goes to a fund for workforce housing. There are several communities in Colorado that enacted this before it was outlawed in our state legislature. And it's been a very helpful tool for those communities. And it's, you know, I appreciate it as something that actually tracks with the housing market. And so, you know, I think it makes, it's very intuitive around making sense. It's just a matter of getting the permission to do it. And Monica, what are the specifics for New Mexico around that? Is that just an ask of the voters, or is there more legwork that's needed?
I believe, I don't know if I have this 100% right, but I believe it's not outlawed in New Mexico. Like there's not state legislation that prevents it, but I believe you do have to take it to the voters, and you might have to be a home rule, what we call a home rule municipality or a home rule local government. I don't know why I can't say that. The city of Santa Fe tried to do this back, I think in the early 90s. And it was very narrowly defeated by the voters. The real estate community really came out against it and had a very strong PR push against the initiative, and it very narrowly failed. So I think it would have passed without the strong opposition from the realtors in Santa Fe. But I know in the, you know, in communities like Taos, where there might not be a ton of development, but there are a lot of home sales, you know, there could be some substantial revenue generated from that could be put back into affordable and workforce housing.
Excellent. We will add that to the funding tools before we publish the slides. We will also add a little bit more on the Affordable Housing Act and the anti-donation clause piece in that public-private partnerships rule. And then I think that, you know, really that brings us to the end today. The case studies that remain in the slide deck can be available to everyone. And I think unless there's anything else anyone wants to raise, we can conclude.
I was going to ask a question, and it doesn't necessarily need to be in the recording or moving forward by any means, but just with the knowledge in the room, I think it would be interesting to hear. So New Mexico, as far as the Fair Housing Incentive Program, I know Colorado has an FHIP, New Mexico does not, Texas does, Oklahoma. So in the region, in the HUD region, they are kind of spread out. I'm just wondering, it sounds like there's one entity in New Mexico, it's Las Cruces, that actually meets all the requirements to be a FHIP. And but the state, I guess they need to add, you know, some more regulations to be able to qualify. So I don't know if any of you are familiar or work with FHIPs or kind of understand their relevance to housing, but wanted to just get your feedback if it's something that has been considered. I don't know the longer history, if there's a reason why it's not something that's priority in New Mexico, or if it's something that would even, is it a game changer for what we need in New Mexico here? Just curious.
Yeah, I have no history with that. Monica, do you?
I also don't know the answer to that question. And I guess because we don't have it in New Mexico, I don't know a whole lot about it. So that would be a really interesting discussion to have with you all as staff from the congressional delegation to understand how that might benefit the state if we did.
Okay, yeah, I'll follow up with you. We had a conversation with HUD and they were highlighting some of the stuff that other states are doing, and it's not relevant, or it's not happening in New Mexico. And so just a little bit of info about FHIP. It's a fair housing initiative program, provides direct assistance to individuals who believe they've been discriminated against in housing. And so it's, it's hopefully supporting keeping folks in housing and not getting discriminated against for just being discriminated and for housing. So I don't know if there's other avenues to how that could benefit New Mexico, but yeah, we can follow up on that too, Monica, and see what it's about. If it makes sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, my comment there would be just that if that is a resource that could be brought to bear, I do see as these sort of gentrification and rising housing cost pressures increase, they put more people at risk, and having resources for people to ensure that they are receiving fair treatment around their housing is really important. And it sounds like there may be some, if there's, and it's typically woefully underfunded.
Yeah.
So, I think that aligns very much around, some of what we're talking about here of, people getting displaced and pushed out, and a lot of injustice happening. So, I think from a big picture perspective, it sounds very worthwhile. And I just don't know the program particulars of navigating that with HUD.
I do know that MFA is I think the entity that does fair housing for the state. So I'm not sure who their fair housing officer is right now, but I know that we used to take, fair housing complaints. So that'd be a really interesting thing to explore. But yes, vastly underfunded, another vastly underfunded HUD program, right?
I'm like, oh, I'm glad to hear there's some funding.
Yeah.
Excellent. Anything else? I think this has been a wonderful, catch-all and opportunity for sharing of ideas. And I really thank you all so much.
Thank you, everyone. We will post this recording on the website, and then we'll be posting the PowerPoint with the revisions we talked about. But I really just wanted to put together a tool that covered like the basics of affordable and workforce housing, so it's all laid out and pretty clear, and just one place where you could access all of it. So I hope that this is a good tool for everyone, and we can certainly add to it as we move forward.
Wonderful. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you.